I want to say a word, hopefully a final word, on the problem of evil. Now, it's in answer to an objection which could possibly be made to things I've said before. Okay, so I talked before about the fact that at the end of time, God will judge and balance the books, so to speak. So those who have suffered innocently will be rewarded and blessed and healed and comforted. But the response might be, so what? And I'm referring now to the kind of response that one gets from people who say, look, if the innocent suffer and you're saying they're going to be rewarded later, none of that changes the reality of what happens to them now and the vileness of it and the fact that God could prevent it. Why doesn't he prevent innocent suffering? It's all right to say, well, people suffer for their own sins, but why should they suffer for the sins of others even now, no matter what happens in the future? And this particular point is brought to its peak in the words of Ivan Karamazov, a fictional character in The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. And he recounts to his pious brother a number of stories that are horrific about the maltreatment of children and animals, about innocent suffering. And he tells these stories very movingly. And then he comes up with these particular lines. Why must we know that confounded good and evil when it costs so much? The whole world of knowledge isn't worth that child's tears to her dear and kind God. I'm not talking of the sufferings of grown-up people, for they have eaten the apple, and to hell with them. Let them all go to hell. But these little ones. He's just told the story of a little child beaten and tortured by its parents. Okay. So what should God do about this, according to this response? Well, he'd have to intervene miraculously every time a serious evil was to be committed. So, for example, God could miraculously intervene so that every time somebody wanted to hit another person with a rod or a stick, that would magically disappear from their hands. That would be one way God could intervene. Every time somebody's about to say a cruel word, God could strike them dumb, or a strong wind could come up and obscure what they said. There are all sorts of things God could theoretically do to prevent any major suffering of the innocent. But here's what I want to say to that. First, if God was to do that, it really would make a mockery of free will. It would no longer be free will if every choice we make that goes beyond a certain level becomes, if you will, obviated, becomes cancelled out by the will of God. Every choice of a certain type effectively gets destroyed. The other problem here is that, apart from this rather childish kind of view of what God could do, and the fact that it would make a mockery of free will, there's another point. It could make people worse, not better. If, when people do evil, they are constantly thwarted, it may very well be that what happens is it makes them more inclined to do evil, more frustrated, more angry at God for intervening, and therefore more opposed to the good. It might not have the desired result. But here's another thing. Most people, when they ask for this, or when they think that that's what God should do, are thinking about other people, other people's acts, other people's cruelties. They're not thinking about their own. They don't want God to intervene in their life. That's not what they first leap to in their imagination. What they want God to do is intervene in other people's lives. So I think we're going to have to put up with the fact that God knows what's best, even though there is much suffering of the innocent in this world due to free will having consequences. Nevertheless, God will bring things to rights. That is the promise we have. In the meantime, does this innocent suffering give us grief? Yes, it does. It certainly does. And it's interesting that the most powerful description of this, the most powerful narrative of this principle, of this response I've been talking about, is in a Christian author, Dostoevsky. You can find similar passages in the book of Job. God actually respects that fundamental dissatisfaction that we have with the suffering in the world. But what he wants our response to be is not to blame him, but to turn our lives around and help make a difference here, to alleviate suffering ourselves, here and now.